Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to episode 3 of Give Freedom a Chance, the podcast of the Libertarian Party UK. There is a weekly conversation we have with interesting people in order to figure out exactly what is going on in our world and how we can strive all to have a little bit more freedom in our lives. Again, I'm your host, Luca Bocci. I've been a journalist for 35 years and more. And as you've seen from the social media posts of the Libertarian Party UK, we will be tackling the big issue of the day, which in reality is the consequences of the budget that has been presented on Wednesday by Rachel Reeves. And not only that, it's just the fact that there is a lot of speculations. And in reality, we've seen that the Labour government is heading the country in a direction that seems to be opposite to what we are all envisioning, all are hoping for in terms of having more freedom, more disposable income, and so on. It seems that the direction of the country is completely wrong, and there have been so many decisions that have been taken that it's going to have really dire consequences, not just for individuals, but especially for working people. And again, there are also kinds of decisions that have been taken in terms of changing the legal system and so on. But in reality, we just wanted to have a conversation to have about the reality of what is the direction of the country and exactly what can we all do in order to bring back sanity, so to speak. So it's obviously a very, very heavy subject, very important for all of our lives. And I can't stay here by myself and talking about it. So I'm going to have to let all my guests today join us. And I can present to you. And here we are. We're going to have, as always, a very well-known architect, world-renowned architect and head architect of Zaha Hadid, Mr. Patrik Schumacher. Hi, Patrik.
Hi there. Happy to be here once more.
Okay. Thanks again. Obviously, always a very interesting conversation. And we're going to have Mark Littlewood, that I'm sure anyone that is familiar with economics knows about, aside from being the former head of the Institute of Economic Affairs, is very well known because thanks for being here. It's just because it's going around every time there is an economics problem and things there, because it's very good at, bringing down the problems from the theory and stuff and bringing them down to reality. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Mark.
Great to be with you, Luca. Hi, Patrik.
Hi there. Hi, good to see you.
So again, I just wanted to just have a thing, because I don't know if you've read, if you've heard about the passing of Peter Whittle, is the head of the New Culture Forum, has been a trailblazer for alternative media, and has always been a voice of reason in terms of bringing about freedom and liberty. And he has created a great thing at the New Culture Forum. And I've read on their social media posts that his passing was sudden, was definitely unexpected, because I think I've saw a video of him just a few days ago, and I was thinking what a treasure he is, and is really, really a shame. But I've read that they want to keep on doing his work, which actually is the most important thing. But I just wanted to give the condolences to his family, to his colleagues, and everyone that knows about him. So I don't know, Patrik or Mark, have you had the chance of meeting Peter Whittle? Because I've lived in London for more than 10 years, but I've never had that luck.
Yeah, I knew him quite well. I've appeared on his shows a lot. Very sad loss. I think it was only a few weeks or so ago that he said he was ill. No, he's a great loss to the wider movement and to public life. Terrific chap, sadly missed.
Patrik, you...
Yeah, I've met him at the Battle of Ideas, where I'm engaged for many, many years with the Academy of Ideas. So yeah, I've met him there. I've watched quite a few of his shows and been contributing. And actually, it's quite nice that he went out throughout the country and has all these branches and events locally as well as in London. And I think that's a bit similar to what Mark is doing with Popcorn, I think, kind of spreading the word by touring the country.
Yeah, actually, that is the thing that I forgot in the introduction, because as always, you're never as prepared as you. Actually, it's been very interesting, because it doesn't happen that often that you have someone that, you're very well known, lots of experience in the economy and stuff, that actually you're doing something on the ground, which is very unusual and actually potentially a game changer, because, it's New Culture Forum was one of the very few that had meetings all over the country. But you're trying to do something similar. So maybe, I don't know, you can explain a bit what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, our mission at Popular Conservatism is to float a new set of ideas. We might come on to these because I think they're upstream, actually, of economic arguments. I think that the Popular Conservative case about restoring some of our constitutional liberties and paring back on the way the state has developed over the last 25 or so years is an overarching priority if we ever want to see a smaller state, free market reform, and freer men and women in Britain. And in order to do that, we are essentially trying to persuade people who may have a role in forming the next government of the UK. Now, your guess is as good as mine as to what the timing or result of the next election will be. But myself, my Popcon colleagues, and Dr. David Starkey, the historian, we spend a lot of time out on the road, typically either speaking to conservative associations or reform branches, trying to persuade them of the unalloyed truth of what we need to do to restore Britain. And the reason we're doing that is, I spend quite a lot of time in the Westminster and media bubble, and it's an important bubble to spend time in because it's how you get your voice across through the media and to the political elite. But I think that's insufficient. I think there needs to be a wider movement up and down the country who, everybody seems to be aware of how broken Britain is, but I think I've got most of the recipe as to what we need to do to fix it. So I probably spend a couple of evenings a week in obscure parts of the country. I'm certainly seeing a lot of Britain evangelizing that message. And I'm delighted to say I think it is slowly but surely getting through.
Well, actually, that's the real change is that. It's just because everything, according to the media bubble, I've been part of the media because I was a news editor for an international video agency based in London and stuff. So I was always going there. If I had to go to the PA, the press association, with some colleagues and stuff, or go to Sky, go to things. It was all inside the M25, and everybody thought we had people coming from all over the world, but they were all based in London. And so we will think that, the rest is flyover country, as they say in America. Just like, yeah.
But what is good is that, of course, you're going out to these places, and it's a double act between you and David, and I've enjoyed watching it. But, of course, you throw it onto YouTube as well. So we also, all of us can enjoy that and be with you on this and see different iterations of that message. And by the way, David just came with the message, and it was absolutely cracking, to the gathering of Rupert Lowe's kind of inner circle, let's say, the so-called Cromwell Club, and where you find actually Conservative Party members who are more tilting and tending to the right, let's say, or into libertarian direction, as well as Reform Party members, as well as independent figures, also people who have been contributing to the New Culture Forum. So David was the star guest, the star speaker, and he really delivered. And and we had a great conversation. So so it is not you're going out there around the country in face-to-face meetings, and but it also, of course, we all can participate. I guess it's all recorded and thrown onto YouTube. And Marco, some of them remains kind of unrecorded.
Yeah, we record as much as we can. Yeah. The technology means that it's easier now, isn't it, for political movements and people of all stripes to get to a much wider audience. And yes, I'm a big fan of, if you've said something that might be of interest, whack it up on YouTube for sure. I don't think you can completely get rid of direct face-to-face contact. And, if you're really trying to persuade people of things, particularly new ideas, you can definitely do that over the internet. But I think to really change somebody's mind, especially if you've got a big, bold, and complicated idea, that although it's expensive, although it's tiring, although it's time-consuming, face-to-face contact still has a big, big role to play in the battle of ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually, I think it's going to be the difference, because nowadays the big risk that we all have is kind of like saying AI stuff, taking our picture, likeness and images, and then concocting something and throwing it out. Well, if you're there in a theater, in an assembly hall or whatever, if you see with your eyes, hear with your ears, well, of course, that's different. And then again, if you go into the meet and greet and stuff, you can have questions and ask questions. And obviously, if anyone is following now, if you have any questions, you can ask them, because that's why we do it live, not just because we are lazy.
And just to throw this in, but that you had in one of your talks, you put up a kind of little QR code or a reference to a WeChat group. And guess what I did? I went into the WeChat group. There weren't many people, but what was wonderful, I made some comments and immediately got in, that was passed on to David, and we got a conversation. We had a wonderful lunch, and then you can really debate for 2.5 hours, and so etc. And I love that element. So you address a large audience, and when you also at this Cromwell Club meeting, you can then kind of afterwards or in between pull close and in a few exchanges drill down and get the point. Yeah. And I think that's really wonderful. And
I think that the reason I think this is so important for those who presently despair about the state of Britain, and my God, there's many different elements to despair about at the moment, is there seems to be a vast number of people who realise that things are going wrong, that they have a sense of things going badly off track, systematically across the board, not just that there's, that taxes are just a notch too high, or that public spending isn't quite as efficient as it should be, or that we're unenamored by the politicians that are leading us. There's not a grumpiness. It's something much deeper than that. There is a deep sense that Britain is heading unsustainably in the wrong direction. But what I think it's quite a lot of conversation is needed to try and really work out what the solution is. If we had worked out exactly what the policy required to turn all of this around is in absolute detail, and it was sitting here on my table, well, then we could just really go into campaign mode. We just need to sell it. But I think there's quite a lot of work to be done on working out precisely what needs to be done by the next government, what can feasibly be done by the next government, in what order does it need to do those things. And that requires a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion, not just propagandizing.
Yeah, and back on that one, I mean, maybe we can kick that off. I think you and David have been pushing this idea that what we really need is a constitutional reset back to 1997. And you've been posing the question, why on earth, after 14 years of conservative government, did we end up in a less conservative country? So maybe, and David mentioned you had this kind of revelatory lunch or dinner.
Yes.
Can you take us there about how you answer that question and what your primary pitch is?
Right. So you're right, Patrik. It starts with an essay question that I had been mulling over. And the essay question was the one that you just stated. Yeah. That why was it, after 14 years of Conservative government from 2010 to 2024, which is a pretty long stretch to be in office for, 14 uninterrupted years. Okay, the first few years were with the Lib Dems, but nevertheless, a Conservative Prime Minister, 5 consecutive Conservative Prime Ministers over 14 years. And my contention was, which I think is an uncontroversial contention, but sometimes people don't make the observation, that if you had taken a snapshot, a photograph, if you like, or hoovered up all the data about the United Kingdom in 2010, and then had taken another snapshot or hoovered up all the data in 2024, and that was all the information that you had to go on, you would have assumed over those 14 years that Britain had been governed by a woke, left-of-centre, socialist-leaning government, because on all of the metrics that you would look at, and we could argue about what metrics you should look at, but I think on all of the obvious metrics, what is the burden of taxation, for example, or what is the scale of state spending, what is the scale of state regulation and the number of regulators, have freedoms such as freedom of speech become easier to exercise, or have they been clamped down on? You name it. And I could barely find a single metric that over that period you would have considered had moved into a conservative direction. Now, you never have the counterfactual, right? I dare say we would have moved in an even more statist direction had Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party won either the 2017 or 2019 election. But nevertheless, 14 years of conservatism, and the UK was not a more conservative place in any discernible way whatsoever. Why might this be so? And I think that the excuses or the reasons that people often reach for are too directly linked and personalised to the individual frailties and proclivities of politicians. So people might say that, you know, Liz Truss tried to act too quickly, Rishi Sunak wasn't bold enough, Boris Johnson got distracted by his wife and therefore went down the crazy rabbit hole of climate change alarmism, etc., etc. Then there are kind of overarching excuses about events, externalities over that period of time, that, you know, we were in coalition with the Lib Dems for 5 years, and then we had the Brexit referendum, and Brexit chewed up an awful lot of our bandwidth. Okay. And then we had the pandemic, and that was all incredibly difficult to deal with. So we sort of took our eye off the ball over a whole range of other things. And I think all of those are worth considering as factors, but probably don't get to the underlying issue. So on the eve of, I think it was literally the eve, the lunch on the day before we launched Popcorn, I had lunch with David Starkey, who I had met on a couple of occasions before but didn't know well. And we conjured with this essay question. And although I was sort of halfway to reaching the conclusion, I mean, I was after all going to launch this outfit the very next day. He put it to me, his analysis he put to me in an incredibly lucid way, that what we allowed to happen really from Tony Blair in 1997 onwards was a great reshaping of the UK state and UK's governmental machinery, such that power has shifted away from Parliament in two major directions. Firstly, to a growing, ever more powerful cluster of quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations, effectively expert committees, which inveigle themselves into virtually every part of our lives. So I'm thinking of Natural England, the Environment Agency, Ofcom, you name it. There are about the Bank of England, even the Office for Budget Responsibility. There are about 400 of these bodies who are essentially bureaucratic experts who on a day-to-day level are really running Britain. All right, they can technically be hauled over the coals by Parliament, but de facto, these are the people running Britain, making decisions, not politicians, or certainly not politicians as much. And the second area in which power has flowed away into a new organism, or has enriched the power of a different part of our structure, is the judiciary. So we have had acts of Parliament that have effectively politicised our judiciary. Through the Human Rights Act, for example, through the Equality Act, through the Climate Change Act, we are increasingly asking or empowering judges to make decisions that I think are better made by politicians. So, for example, on pay rates between men and women, this is now a legal matter which will go to a court to be litigated about, you know, should men who work in a warehouse be paid the same as, you know, women who work as classroom assistants or whatever it might be. These become legal issues, not political issues. And in consequence, the excuse, I guess you'd say, or at least the explanation that one would give for the Conservative failure over that period of time, was that the structures of government were essentially all geared and leaning in a leftist, statist, egalitarian direction. And the effort to get anything done that might be free market, deregulatory, empowering individual men and women rather than empowering the state, you could get some of these things done, but it was basically an exercise in pushing water uphill. The entire machine would be raged against you if you attempted any of these things. And therefore, the default setting of Britain, because of these new governmental structures, a politicised judiciary, and a massive quangocracy. What you've built in is a ratchet effect, which the normal default setting is to increase tax, increase spending, involve the state in the solutions to virtually any problem that you care to name, to increasingly regulate individual men and women and businesses in order to make sure that they are more and more compliant over a whole range of different vectors and factors. So if you sit there in government and do nothing, the drift will be to the socialist, statist left. That's the drift built into the system. And if you want to give classical liberal, libertarian or conservative ideas a chance, because this won't give them a guarantee, it will give them a chance, we basically need to reset the British Constitution to roughly where it was before Blair came to power, which means unwinding probably all, certainly nearly all of these 400 or so quangos. I would hope we could just abolish a good number of them outright. But those that do have some remaining important functions, if they are not to be abolished or privatized, need to be brought wholly within ministerial control. The minister needs to be completely empowered. There shouldn't be a battle between a minister and a quango, as we've witnessed in recent weeks between the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Office for Budget Responsibility. So if ministers want their experts, and I'm all in favour of that, it's always worth listening to expertise. That should be in-house. And secondly, we've got to get the judiciary back in its box. So they aren't ruling out a whole range of policies on human rights grounds or equalities grounds. I don't think it should be the courts that decide whether or not it's appropriate to deport people to Rwanda, for example. You can argue about whether you like that policy or dislike that policy, whether you think it would be effective as a deterrent, whether you think it would be a waste of money. There's a whole range of legitimate arguments to be had about it. But the case that David Starkey and I would make would be that case should be heard in Parliament. And if Parliament determines that that is the way it wishes to deal with immigration, that should stick. It shouldn't then be unpicked on some basis around the Human Rights Act by a judge. So oddly, for somebody who leans greatly into libertarian thinking, I find myself actually arguing that the way we need to get out of the nightmare we're in is at first instance to re-empower politicians such that the people that we put into Parliament and the government we elect are actually able to do things. And if they do things we don't like, we can at least remove them. That does not in any way guarantee that we will move to a much more free market orientated, classically liberal orientated or conservative country, but it gives it a fighting chance. We would at least be competing on a level playing field. So my take on things is if we don't in Britain get these constitutional and governmental structures repaired and corrected, probably everything else is for the birds, because the governmental structures and the judicial structures of the UK at the moment make the sort of ideas that I'm sure the three of us would agree on almost impossible to enact. So stage one, priority one, fix and reset the constitution. If Britain were a computer rather than a country, this would be like going into it and resetting it to the settings it was on in 1997. And essentially, I would like to do that whilst making sure that the European Union app remains removed. So that's my great mission. That's what I'd like to bring about. And it's quite a complicated thing to sell. It's not a retail proposition. It's a very deep proposition. And a lot of work needs to be put in to persuade people to even engage in discussions about governmental machinery or constitutional protocols, when most people are more engaged and the media is more engaged on the day-to-day levels of, has tax gone up 1% or down 1%? Has state spending gone up or down? Is, the NHS working or not working? All of those at the coalface things tends to be the meat and drink of our day-to-day economic and political discussion. But I actually want to sort of give a meta-analysis that the constitution and the structures of government matter enormously. And if we do not fix them and fix them soon and fix them right, we're doomed.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like saying, just remember the IT Crowd, the comedy series. Have you tried turning the computer on and off again, off and on again? So pretty much that's a problem. But the big problem is that even if you do that, it will not reset instantaneously by itself. You need to go there with a scalpel and think about, okay, where did the country go wrong? It's quite clear. 1997, the Blairite government decided to put in all this kind of legislation that had been thought for 30 years. So it's all the Fabian approach to stuff and saying, okay, we will go there and put roadblocks over roadblock and so on. So first of all, civil servants, they're not just, neutral and stuff. No, they're highly politicized. Then the judges, of course, magistrates and stuff, highly politicized. Activist judges, they're going there and they're changing the law so that Parliament says, hold on a second, the law was different. So again, that's a vaste programme, as General de Gaulle said back in the day when they said death to idiots, and he said, oh yeah, well, vaste programme, yeah, of course. It's a big task. And again, Patrik, I thought you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
It's a very striking thesis, and I think it has been picked up. And I think many people running with it. I recently saw Ben Habib from Advance UK kind of reiterating this thesis, not attributing to you guys. And it makes sense. And I even, to some extent, suspect that a Corbynite left and your party will also would like to get rid of these quangos. And that's why you're quite right. It's giving freedom a chance. But it also means that then what we're doing with these powers. And it's like Brexit. Brexit was an opening and a chance to do much more free market things and free trade policies, but it wasn't guaranteed. On the other hand, coming out of Europe also was supported by a lot of left groups because they saw the chance and do more statism. And that, and if you talk about calling back in all these powers into parliamentary processes, that is also something we need to debate. I mean, you said quite rightly, outright abolish and maybe push back into civil society, into private actors, to self-regulation. That will be my first priority. Also, rather than burdening parliament or ministries with these powers, which, quite frankly, I don't trust them they could actually process and deal with. Is what I see with respect to parliamentarians and the parliamentary process, and is already overburdened by, taking in 45% of GDP or 40 and redistributing and allocating it. That they can't do properly, and they're totally overburdened by them, not geared up to this, as well as regulating 100% of GDP in ways which are putting sand into the gear of the whole process. So what I feel is that it is actually easier politically to kind of undo these quangos and therefore reduce regulation, reduce interference and state kind of operations which are semi-state. And that's the good opportunity, I think, to say, in particular with the next government coming in, and if they're prepared not to draw this all back in and be kind of swamped suddenly in with powers that they can't actually discharge, but say to us, release them back into civil society, into industry, self-organizing, and make that a kind of freedom fest, if you like. And that means also help generating an economic miracle we badly need. So that was the conversation also with David, and he agrees with that. Outright unwinding and giving the powers back to society at large, meaning private actors and self-organizing civil society actors.
Yeah, I listen, I don't disagree with you on that. I mean, I know in discussions with libertarians, you can, often get into kind of angels on a head of a pin argument about exactly how big the state should be between, the anarcho-capitalist tendency, the night watchman state tendency, the minarchist tendency, and no doubt various other philosophical strands as well. No, I mean, I want a much, much, much smaller state. You're quite right, Patrik, that the government evidently is doing so much it can't do anything remotely well, and we need to have a discussion about getting back to the core functions of what the state should do. As I say, within libertarian circles there will be different strands of opinion on exactly how big or small the state should be, but I think the vast bulk of people, even those who don't identify as being libertarian, would agree that the state is now just too enormous and therefore it is impossible for it to run competently. But I think a staging post to that is what has disappeared from our politics at the moment is basically accountability. Okay, so let me give you an anecdote about that, which I think illustrates it. We might well want in some glorious future to wholly abolish the Department for Education, for example. But let's assume for the time being that we've got one, that we think it should probably be less intrusive, that let's say if there is going to be a national curriculum, it shouldn't be as detailed and prescriptive as it is at the moment. But if there is, insofar as the state has a role in education, I want the Education Secretary to be responsible and accountable for that. And what we have at the moment is a nonsense. And this takes me back a few months to a news story that broke about an incident that had happened in a classroom somewhere. I can't remember exactly in which part of the UK it was, but the gist of the incident was that one 9-year-old boy in the classroom had called another 9-year-old, had accused another 9-year-old boy in the classroom of smelling like fish. I guess the sort of thing that 9-year-old boys tend to say to each other. This led to the police being called to this school. And it seemed that the whole incident was dealt with in a ludicrously heavy-handed way. I don't know all of the details, but that's the sketch of what happened. Okay, so then we get Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, being invited to appear on a whole host of radio and television programs and being asked, well, what the hell is going on here, Mrs. Phillipson, Secretary of State? What on earth is going on in the British education system? This seems absolutely ridiculous. That the police are being called out to deal with 9-year-olds hurling, rather juvenile insults at each other. And her response, and this is what I think rather proves my point, was that she said, well, I can't comment on operational matters. And, well, why can't you comment on operational matters? What is the point of having an education secretary if it cannot be put to them what on earth is going on in Britain's classrooms? And she'll tell me that's an operational matter. Or we saw a similar instance of a lack of accountability with Shabina Mahmood when she was Justice Secretary. Robert Jenrick, her opposition brief, the Conservative Justice spokesman, had come across, discovered new guidance that was going to be issued by one of these quangos, the Sentencing Guidance Council, another one of these groups, independent expert committees. And the gist of that was that they were arguing that in sentencing, more account should be taken of your religion or ethnicity, in the anticipation that those who are from minority religions or ethnicities would be treated more leniently by the courts when a sentence was handed down upon a guilty verdict. So Jenrick cross-examines Mahmood over the dispatch box about this. And although I can't be sure of it because I'm basing it on her sort of facial expressions, it seemed to me that Mahmood was unaware that this guidance had been issued at all. Or if she was, she hadn't read it in any great detail. And she then sort of distances herself from it. And a whole battle erupts in which she basically promises to write them a very stiff letter, which she duly does, and gets back a rather impertinent reply, and eventually works her way through to clipping the limbs of the Sentencing Guidance Council. I don't think she's abolished it, but she's given herself the power to override its advice. So these two anecdotes, not that I would trust necessarily Mahmood to run our justice system, and certainly not Bridget Phillipson to run our education system. I'm with you, Patrik. I'd like a lot more power to be granted to parents in determining what funding they get rather than bureaucrats. But what I would like is that the people who are in nominal control of these big state projects to be directly responsible for what happens, and not to be able to just say, these are operational matters, these procedural matters, nothing to do with me. That proves that we are basically run by a bureaucracy, not a democracy. And you might get your wish, Patrik, that if we actually put the politicians in direct control of the whole thing and held them accountable for everything, they would quite quickly realize that the state is doing too much and it is too big. And if they keep it at that size, they're going to be called up an awful lot for every single error it makes. So I think in this regard, we can have our cake and eat it. But if you get accountability back into the system, we can at least have these debates, these political discussions, this discourse, and elections to determine which way we want to go. I don't want to in any way suggest that Britain has gone as badly wrong as the Warsaw Pact, But we're not many steps away, I think, from our election process being pretty irrelevant and our parliament being a kind of Potemkin parliament, that we all go around pretending that the politicians are running things and in charge, where in reality, on a day-to-day level, it's the bureaucracy in charge. That bit needs to change. If that doesn't change, not even a libertarian elected government, if the Libertarian Party of the UK, by some miracle, won 340 seats at the next election, you will not be able to get anything done unless you fix those governmental structures. And you need to empower the politicians first. There's a risk. It sounds counterintuitive for small statists, but I think that is the route. That is stage one on the journey to get to the sort of country that I think the three of us would likely agree we want to get to.
Yeah, the massive problem is that this is not an accident. This has been by design for ages. So this is the direction that we're seeing, not just in the UK, but all across Europe and stuff. So in Europe, when you are under the European Union and stuff, you can always say, well, Europe asked me. I think I'm based in Italy at the moment, and so the Italian Parliament just approved a law that says that if you want to engage in any kind of amorous act with your counterpart, you need to have present and constant consent, and it has to be actual. So it means that in the middle of things, she decides that now not feeling it anymore, and she wants to get out. You have to stop immediately, and you have to prove that your consent was actual in all the events that led to the thing, and then after. So if she changes her mind 1 year down the road, you are a criminal because the consent was not there. So this is just like a legal impossibility. So you're putting the situation, and the president of the tribunal in Milan said, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. If you are a man, you're always going to be responsible for that. So you should abstain. And they said, well, but this government is supposed to be a conservative government. Why the hell did you approve that? Oh, yeah, because there was a convention that was approved in Istanbul. And so right now it's being pushed down from up to all governments and stuff. This is coming to the UK as well, because even if it's not in the European Union, it's happening again. So this is really the massive problem. You need the legwork and the philosophical discussion in order to say, okay, this is how the constitution should be changed. And this is an opportunity because the UK has got a very special constitution in terms of saying that the parliament is supreme. So you can change it. With an act of parliament, you can repeal all the laws you want, to restructure completely the constitution. And this is not the same. In Italy, it's impossible. In France, it's impossible. In Germany, God forbid. In America as well. You can't do that. The UK has it. The problem is no one is talking about what needs to be done to avoid the train wreck that is coming in a few years. Going back to the economy instead. We talked about before the fact that the trial by jury is a fact that predates the Magna Carta. So it's literally 1,000 years old, more than 1,000 years old. And it was gone. It's gone just because, oh yeah, we have a backlog. It's slightly inconvenient. So we will only have trial by jury on specific and particularly egregious penal cases. And this is one of the things that said, what was that? Rahm Emanuel, I think it was the former chief of staff of Obama, President Obama in the US. He said, never let a good crisis go to waste. This is the kind of thing. Oh, there is a backlog. Okay, we'll get rid of trial by jury. So this is the point. It seems like the progressive forces actually they have an objective. They want to get to a place. I don't think libertarians, conservatives, anyone that cares about personal freedom has got a direction. So we don't have a plan. They do, because every single time they see an opening, they go there and they change something. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's.
Let me come in. I just want to first of all say yes, I subscribe to that. This accountability element is very, very important. And to the quangocracy is really terrible, and I think we can also say what David is arguing, and that's a very strong argument for that. These are single issue quangos, so they have sort of one target at a time, and if they're left alone, they're making a kind of they're not balanced against each other. And that would be a politician and parliament be able to do, or prime minister would be able to do. So that is also a fundamental problem. And David points to the kind of COVID thing. But I wanted to move on to another topic in terms of bringing the state, reining it in. And let's say we have a government coming on, you call it center-right, and I hope that we can inject a kind of more libertarian element into that. I love the way you've been talking about ways of mediating and graduating in a kind of reduction of the state expenditure and state regulatory powers. And you've been talking about the key 3 areas where expenses has been very, very large and rising and unsustainably rising, which is one on the hand, NHS, health, welfare, and we have a runaway process there, as well as education, which is more stable. These are the 3 big chunks. And I wanted to, just rehearse your argument, then invite you to think one step further. I mean, the idea of opting out, of allowing private, people with a certain income to opt out of the NHS and go private fully, and then forgo the right to use the NHS and basically step out of the queue. You have the element of pensions, for instance, as well as part of welfare, that you would opt out of that and look after yourself, and therefore maybe national insurance and your let's say a full kind of self-insurance, national insurance contribution no longer be happening, as well as out of school. State school system. So that is, and I was wondering, I mean, that's maybe a bit, so that I thought really very strong, and I feel as a Libertarian Party, that's the kind of thing we can put on our policy program as an interim step, and I think that is something which I haven't seen on any other party. So I hope that reformer conservatives will put something on their manifesto. I was thinking just, was inspiring me to think one step further. And how about the judiciary you want to put back into its box? Could I also somehow opt out? And we have these queues, endless queues at courts. And I'm in a few kind of cases, and it's just disheartening to that, the normally average or expected times are kind of exceeded by multiples to go to private courts. So I'm not using the courts. I would use private courts. And give more scope to that. Arbitration is already taking over a lot of businesses. Maybe that is expanded, and maybe that's another way in opting out of this. Or is that for you too much of a core competency of the state?
No, I mean, and not necessarily. And I haven't got a detailed, worked out policy program in each of these areas. I've just got a concept, and you summarized it very well there, Patrik. That the idea would be that rather than that you give people a lot of incentive and encouragement to choose after a period of deliberation, possibly, that they wish in 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 different ways to make their own arrangements rather than rely on the state for them. And in essence, the incentive would be you would get some sort of kickback for that, some sort of tax break, for example. So, and we've moved everything in the wrong direction here, right? So we're adding extra taxes onto your children's school fees if you send them to private school, rather than saying, actually, if you get your kids out of the state queue, we will give you, some chunk of money or a tax break to reflect that. Similarly, private medical insurance, you used to be able to write off against tax if it was, for example, a benefit provided by a company that you worked for, that you were given private medical insurance. That was a tax write-off. No more. Is it a tax write-off? So let's look at healthcare as the example. I won't duck your question on the judiciary. I've got some thoughts on that as well. But health as an example, what I had in mind, and I don't pretend to have worked the numbers out, just the concept, is in rough terms, it's £3,000 a year is the cost of the NHS per person. Now, this varies enormously because you don't use it consistently year on year. You tend to, you need it when you're born, and you need it more and more as you get old. So although it's £3,000 a year on average, it could be a colossal amount in one year and zero in a lot of other years. So you'd need to work out the kind of correct algorithm there. But let's say as somebody who's basically healthy and in my early 50s, that you calculated my likely cost to the NHS in any given year was, let's say, £1,500. £1,500. You know, I'm not at the end of my life, or at least I hope not. I'm unlikely to need much care. I think you'd probably still need to cover me for accident and emergency. If I'm hit by a bus and bleeding in the road, probably the ambulance that picks me up is probably provided by the state. But why not give me the option? And this could actually be a kind of win-win deal between the state and the individual. Mr. Littlewood, our algorithm shows that your likely cost to the NHS this year, next year, and until you're 60 is £1,500 a year. We're not going to offer you all of that 1,500 quid, but we will offer you £1,000 if you get out of the way. And I actually sort of think to myself, well, with £1,000, I could probably get myself a decent private healthcare package for, I don't know, £2,500, £3,000. Yeah, I'd like to take that, please. I will get out of your way. I will expect it still to be covered for, you know, an unforeseen emergency or accident. But in terms of my general healthcare, seeing a GP, getting my prescription drugs or whatever else, I'll go with Bupa or AXA PPP or somebody like that. And so you get these people out of the queue without, whilst the state is genuinely saving real money, rather than me costing 1,500 quid a year as a predicted average on the National Health Service. I'm out of that, and they only give me £1,000 a year for sake of argument to get out of the queue. So it's a win-win if you see this as a deal between the state and the individual. I agree it's not a purist libertarian position. A purist libertarian position would just be, you're out, okay, you don't get X and we don't charge you for it. But as a second best position, a practically implementable position, I think this could work. And you could start encouraging people, I don't know, let's say people who are paying the higher rate of income tax, so people whose earnings are north of £50,000 a year, you could start by saying, look, basically, we're sort of expecting you to get out of the NHS system. We think that you've probably got the wherewithal to pay for private healthcare. We're going to give you an incentive to do it. We're not going to give you the full cost saving of doing it, but we'll give you 2/3 of it for sake of argument. And we really think that you should actively consider covering your non-emergency, non-accident health needs elsewhere. That works. I mean, I think what we need to do is to get into these huge areas of the state, some private sector crowding in, rather than always worrying about public sector crowding out. We need to crowd in the private sector. Same would go, I think, should go for schools. I would go in completely the opposite direction to the one taken by the Labour government of imposing VAT on schools. I think that's objectionable. I think you say, right, you've got your little kid here, Jimmy. If you're sending him to a state school, we know that this will cost X £1,000s a year between now and the age of 18. And again, that varies a bit according to which stage of education you're in. If you wish to make your own arrangements to educate Jimmy, and we'd probably keep in place that it's compulsory to educate Jimmy. That's a duty on the parents. You can't just choose to utilise Jimmy as a chimney sweep. You've got to make sure Jimmy is educated. But if you want to send him to a private school, be my guest. And again, we'll give you back 2/3 of the money that we would otherwise have spent on Jimmy's education if he was in the state system. Again, a win-win. The state saving money, the individual gets a kickback and is able to pursue a private function. Now, on the judicial point, look, I am in favour of private arbitration. I think that's, usually a good way of, and that exists, right? You, as far as I'm aware, you can go to arbitration and get out of the court system, certainly in a large number of ways. I think the only note of caution I would place on that, in the hope that I don't come across as some sort of giant socialist statist by saying so, is I think those courts need to be within some sort of agreed framework. So I'm quite concerned about the amount of arbitration that goes through Sharia courts, for example, in the UK. I'd be interested in your view on that from a libertarian perspective. Do we just say, well, that's fine if people wish to contract themselves via a Sharia court? We have no view on this one way or another. My sense is, although I haven't investigated in an enormous detail, but my sense is that women in Sharia courts don't get a fair hearing. And you might therefore consider that although that is on the face of it a privately chosen means of arbitration, in practice, it isn't really an acceptable means of arbitration. You might reach that conclusion. I'm not sure I want to go all of the way there, because I say I like arbitration, but you might well reach that conclusion. So a little bit more problematic when it comes to the judiciary, but finding easier, quicker means to arbitrate in the private sector as an alternative to court. I'm not quite sure what the barrier is to that at the moment, but if there are any, remove those barriers. But it might get you swifter justice. It's not obviously a massive cost saving. So if you're looking at how on earth do we get the public finances into something approaching sustainability and balance, well, as you rightly said, Patrik, if you look at NHS spending, education spending, and welfare, that's to say transfer payments, that amounts to what? Around about, in rough and ready terms, 2/3 of all government expenditure. So if you are interested in making big savings, that's where you should be looking. You should be asking somebody like me, although I'm probably a bit too close to pension age now, you should have asked somebody like me 30 years ago, do you want the state pension, in which case you'll have to pay this stamp? If not, if you can show you're making private provision and you won't come knocking at our door when you turn 66, 67 or 68, that's fine. And you don't need to pay this chunk of your insurance stamp. That's where the big savings are. It might be we could get a faster justice system if there were better means of private arbitration. And I'm very much open to those ideas, but there's no big cost savings to be made there. If you would want a future centre-right government to be looking to save, I don't know, 100 billion, 150 billion, 200 billion pretty quickly, almost overnight, or at least in its first budget or so from public finances, you've got to go searching in the health, education and welfare area, because the rest of the ledger on the budget, I mean, you can play around with it. I'm all in favour of closing down the Arts Council and abolishing the foreign aid budget, but these are nickel and dime things. So the big ticket items, if you were to look at this as a mathematical question rather than a purely ideological one, health, education and welfare, we need to crowd in the private sector in order to ensure that the public sector gets smaller in those areas.
Yeah, I think it's. I think I've read it somewhere that the whole point is, in order to fix the UK budget, you would just need one simple thing. That would be to just roll back the benefits and disability benefits and stuff like that to pre-COVID era. Mm-hmm. So if you bring it back, you will earn something like £50 billion. Which is not small change, not even in a government that just regulates 45% of the economy like it happens in the UK. So this is just one thing. Just wanted to go back to the whole Sharia court thing. This is actually to see that as an arbitration. I know that from a legal point of view, this is exactly how the legal system of the UK treats it. But I think this is very dangerous, because we're not talking about arbitration and stuff. Because if I go to arbitration, let's say I have in my employment contract that if there is any kind of dispute between me and my employer, I would just need to go to an arbitration. And this is kind of a common if you're going to the higher echelons and stuff. So it's generally, this is the rule. You get to arbitration. And but this arbitration court is not following their own rules. It's just following the law of the land. If you're going to a Sharia court, okay, UK law says that if you want to divorce your wife, you need to go there and have a certain, procedure and stuff. There are laws and rules. You're entitled to 50% of the house that you bought together and stuff. So there is all these rules. If you go to a Sharia court, I go there in front of a witness, and I say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. That's it. You're gone. If I'm a man. If the woman wants to get divorced, that's a whole different thing. So we're talking about a legal system that is completely different from the UK one. And you're just accepting so that there is different rules for different people, which means going back to the pre-Magna Carta thing, where if I'm a nobleman and I kill a peasant, well, I just give him a few coins and that's it. But if I'm a peasant and I kill a nobleman, my head goes on the chopping block, quite literally. So this is
interesting. I mean, we may be going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but I think this is interesting and worth exploring a bit further. So I think we would agree one thing, wouldn't we, that that English law needs to out-trump the arbitration system. So that's say if you go through arbitration and you are dissatisfied, you can then appeal through the state legal process. That I think we would agree. If we agree, therefore, that arbitration, Patrik, I don't want to ask you about the specifics of the various disputes you're in, but Patrik and the various legal things he needs to resolve goes through arbitration. If he's, perhaps 3 of them get resolved perfectly well, 2 of them he's not happy about, fine, he can then go through the court process on those 2, those ones where arbitration has failed. If that's the case, how prescriptive should we be about the nature of the court or people or body that's arbitrating, as long as they are selected? And obviously informal arbitration happens all the time. I'm speculating here, but I'm hypothesizing, a couple who've got marital difficulties might go and talk to their local priest about it, as a sort of interlocutor to try and talk it through. Marriage guidance counselling is a sort of form of arbitration. To what extent should we be specific about what the rules and frameworks of that arbitration are? I'm not a Catholic, but I can understand that Catholics might want a Catholic priest involved in arbitrating their disputes. So I think it's a bit of a thorny one. To my mind, it's potentially resolved as long as you always have the English courts as a backstop. So I'll try going through ACAS, I'll try going through the Catholic Church or whatever else it might be, because that looks like it could be a faster, cheaper, more efficient, easy way to resolve things. If that doesn't work, I've got the English courts as a backstop. Now, that would allow Sharia courts if you stuck to that model. And the reason I still have some nervousness is I am not persuaded that the women have properly and formally consented to that means of arbitration. That's my worry in essence.
Yeah, I think it's the whole relationship between the civil and the religious system, especially in continental Europe, has always been very thorny, because before there was a law on divorce, the only way you can get your marriage dissolved was it to have it annulled by the Sacra Rota, which is the ecclesiastical tribunal, which was meant to demonstrate that the marriage actually never took place. Mm-hmm. It was never properly done. So this was the way out, the wiggle room, and stuff. And the whole point was that it was completely unfair, because the Sacra Rota was very expensive. You needed to have a solicitor that was specialized in canonical law. And so it meant that if you were a regular working class guy, you were stuck with your marriage. But if you were wealthy, you were, a notary or member of parliament, you could go to the Sacra Rota and have it annulled. Mm-hmm. But the whole point was that in order to have the the canonical legislation work with the civil code, you needed to have this kind of agreement with the church, between the church and the state, so that they said, well, we have watched the canonic law and we think that this law is compatible with the civil law. In terms of Sharia law, I may have some problems with that. Big problems.
But this is turning into an unexpected but extremely interesting area of discussion. Presumably, Luca, if you're a pure libertarian, you don't think the state should recognize marriage at all, right? You can obviously enter into a contractual arrangement with your partner, but why is it any business of the state to keep a record of this? You may even within the tax system, for example, allow people to nominate one significant other for the purposes of, say, inheritance tax, but it needn't necessarily be your wife or husband, I suppose. So isn't the more pure libertarian position on marriage is that you leave it to individuals and their God?
Let me come in. I absolutely agree. And I think I feel quite, problematic. At least in the UK, there's this moment where you actually decide to marry and you register, and that then sets off. But it's only a one-fit-all, a one-option contract, and no much free elements. There's maybe a prenuptial element, etc. But there's not a menu of different choices, which I would find more interesting, where you have a kind of more temporary marriage, etc., etc. In Europe, they've gone much further. That actually, once you move together with somebody and you have a kind of relationship, everything is a quasi-marriage flows in, and I think that's very, very problematic, because you kind of slip into a legal arrangement and you wake up and you don't know what you've done to your kind of.
I think it's common law. It's common law marriage.
In the end, they don't even marry anymore because. But I find these things problems. So I do think it's important that we have choices and more free contracting. This would also be for work arrangements. And I think you mentioned the Equalities Act. That's a problem on many levels in running a company. The employment law, expanding. But I also wanted to, and I believe much more in free contracting and having much more generalized and reduced set of employment law.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I do feel inhibited with respect to you saying there's informal arbitration or you make arrangements, you discuss, with, for instance, issues you have with your employees. That's extremely difficult because everything is so prescribed. You probably have a lot of tripwires, so you actually can't do that. It nearly is an automatic process into a tribunal and lawyers. Anytime we have any kind of issue with a potential employee and the board meets, legal experts come, HR, and it's a big issue because there's lots of risk downstream. And I think the best protection would actually be competition between employers for the employees, and the market would be much more open and we would hire much more easily if it wasn't such a kind of big risk now. And now the risk is much higher because you have from day one, you have the right to call into tribunal and talk about unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, etc.
Patrik, an interesting thing here. Let me come up with a second best solution here, rather than necessarily a purist libertarian solution.
I'm looking for that.
So, wouldn't a second best position be that all of the accrued rights that we've given to workers, let's just say for the sake of argument, the workers are going to keep them. So you have rights to maternity pay, rights to pay if you're sick, or the whole enchilada. So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that all of the rights that the state has given to workers, and therefore the duties that they've given to employers, are, for the sake of argument, the correct ones. I know that none of us would think that, but let's just, for the sake of argument, have that as our premise. You should at least be able, surely, to make them tradable. So you might find, for example, Patrik, that you're considering hiring a female employee in her early 20s, and you take on that female employee. And my second best solution is that that whilst the state would still make it an obligation upon you to pay her maternity pay, she can sell that right away. She could actually say to you, look, Patrik, you've agreed to pay me X pounds a month. You've agreed that I'm going to work 38 hours a week. You've agreed I've got 20 days annual holiday. And you're also obliged to agree that if I become pregnant, I get this amount of time off at this sort of salary. However, Patrik, whilst I've got all of these rights, I'd like to sell some of them back to you. I'm happy to waive my maternity leave because I have no intention of having a child. So how about you put £3,000 additional on my salary? I am a very hard-working person, so I don't feel that I need 20 days of annual leave. I'd be happy to take 15. Can you please pay me to work for the other 5? So it's a kind of Ronald Coase solution, really. Coase argues that as soon as once you're decided where the property rights lay, once it's clear who has which rights and they're tradable, you will then get to an optimal situation. So even if we are to endow people with all of these rights and abilities, and I understand that the Labour government is now not going to give you unfair dismissal rights from day one. It will be 6 months in. The government seems to have U-turned on that just today. But whatever rights you've got, let's, for the sake of argument, not as a second best practical solution, let's not take them away, but let the employee sell them back to the employer if they wish.
Great. I mean, I love your proposals. Yeah. That's really good. I like that. These are kind of solutions where you can gradually kind of expand also. And if that picks up and there's more and more free contracting, similar with the other opt-in things, if they have a dynamic of crowding back in the private and not crowding out, I think these are wonderful kind of mediating proposals which I really love. And then one can kind of test out what the market actually on both sides would go for and would opt in for. I have another point I wanted to make in terms of a similar issue. Let's say, how do you stage the attack, inverted commas, on, let's say, kind of ballooning welfare system? which I think is a tragedy. If I would reflect on the biggest tragedy of the advanced Western civilization, is this kind of shifting into a welfare state, entitlements, which I think are kind of poison and lead to, it's the temptation we all feel is on our bones to kind of go the easy way and go into benefits, disability, and it's easy to do it. And once you're in there, it's hard to get out. And maybe you're unhappy about these choices. And I think it's the same as feeds back into the early generation. You have truism and so on, because there's a way of living dysfunctionally, let's say, without fully contributing, fully developing. It's a huge tragedy. So how to get out of that is at this stage extremely difficult. And when it was introduced, and by the way, there was this wonderful world of mutual aid societies, friendly societies, where we had covered over 90% of the urban workforce and 70% of the rural workforce at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And then you have this kind of crowding out of this wonderful ecosystem, I would say, into a welfare system, where it's difficult to manage, where it's difficult to have social control, where the incentives are out, kind of slipping, and you have waste, fraud, and abuse, if you like, on a scale which means that the system a few decades in, or after 20 years, already runs into a crisis point, and the war and the kind of back and forth, a kind of war of attrition between kind of trying to kind of squeeze and put up the squeeze, and then kind of letting loose again. And it is a kind of, it's a really tragical kind of, I think, display.
Yeah.
But I see this point, and I see it in this light, by the way. Reform, and I was asking you what you think about it. Reform made that proposition now in the context of curbing migration, and we can maybe come to that topic as well, that they're saying now that there's no welfare for any foreigners. Welfare is only reserved for citizens. Now that's very tough, and it's just unmediated. It comes in, but my prediction is people will survive. They will actually flourish. They will be able to cope with this situation, and that will send a signal. Maybe if that works for them, why couldn't it be also then, a good example of working for others? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Whether, if that trial works, and we find that we have highly productive foreign nationals, none of whom are claiming any welfare, and all who are, earning a good living and generally contributing to the economy and society, maybe you're right. Maybe that's an example of, you could almost see it as a pilot case for rolling out welfare reform more widely. My slight worry with that approach is it implied in it, or maybe I'm just inferring this from the reform policy rather than it being implied, but I'm concerned there's an implication that the present welfare system for Indigenous British nationals is acceptable, and we should keep it as is. And the only problem is foreign nationals dipping into the system. Well, for the same reasons that you've articulated there, Patrik, I'm concerned that we've got too many British nationals caught in this kind of welfare doom loop of, and potentially now, generations of people who've never been to work, welfareism passed down from parents to children. So I would like to tackle it. And again, this is a kind of neoclassical economics solution rather than a purist libertarian one. I was quite taken, and again, I'll be able to give you the gist, even if I can't remember the details, of the reforms that were brought in by Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin in the 1990s. And there's a certain statist element here, but essentially it was that there is a work requirement on citizens. If you wish to be able to claim welfare because you're sick or whatever, you need to be, as soon as you are well, willing to work. We're not just going to give you unemployment benefit because you haven't got a job. So it was quite a statist approach in which the Wisconsin governor, in essence, I'm simplifying for effect, said, right, well, if you're on unemployment benefit, you need to turn up at the park gates at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll give you something to do. It might not be enormously productive. You'll probably be picking up litter or, sweeping the pavements or rubbing graffiti down from some of the walls. But you will need to do that in order to claim your unemployment benefit. We're basically going to give you work. And if you don't show up and you haven't got a compelling excuse, you don't get paid, just like in the proper workforce. And therefore, I think they were expecting that what they would get after a while would be very clean parks with very little graffiti on the walls near the parks. But of course, what actually happened is that folks might have turned up at the park gates on day 1, day 2, or even week 2 or week 3, but they very quickly decided that the better option to them was to actually find a real job in the private sector. So merely changing the incentives, that's to say in economic terms here, what you're doing is not allowing people to choose infinite leisure time. You are saying, actually, if you're on welfare and you're saying you can't find a job, we will give you something to do, which is not playing on your PlayStation or watching television between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. It is doing something, picking up litter, washing things, stuffing envelopes, whatever it might be. And if you take away that leisure incentive, well, I don't really like getting up in the morning. I prefer lying in till noon, and then I just get up and watch television, and I'm getting, for sake of argument, £10,000 a year of welfare for doing that. And that beats me going in and getting a job that might give me, for sake of argument, £11,000 a year, because although I'd be richer if I did the job, I would lose all that leisure time. So I think the incentive way to structure it is to make, you need to earn your own leisure, basically. That the starting point is not that you get 24 hours of leisure a day, 7 days a week, unless you're willing to forego any state benefits. I mean, I don't want to say, leisure is a great thing in our lives, but it needs to be whittled down. If we are giving you money, the money should be in return for work, and that worked well in Wisconsin. You've still obviously got the carve-outs and the difficulties about what you do with regard to people who, are chronically disabled or have had a full-scale breakdown of some sort. There will probably be some segment of society that will need support and can't work. But even there, if you talk to, disabled charities, they are, keen on finding ways in which people with disabilities can work and function. They don't want to be useless parts of society. They want to overcome those obstacles and contribute. So I think my approach would be a workfare scheme with regard to people who have got into this death spiral of welfarism and leisure and no productivity at the expense of others. That's be the way I'd tackle it. More generally, though, as I was saying, my general overarching solution to health and education could just as well be applied to welfare, right? Even if you were to make it compulsory that people must buy a welfare package, because, Patrik, if you're, suddenly struck down by some illness or you have an accident tomorrow, I don't want to bail you out. I think you could make an argument that it's compulsory for you to be insured. And in effect, the welfare state is a sort of insurance mechanism. You have to pay your taxes and you will get whatever welfare benefits that you are entitled to were such an accident befall you. But why not say, actually, as we would with private healthcare, for example, you can opt out of that system as long as you can show you've got the wherewithal to look after yourself should such disaster strike. So, and in return for that, we will cut your national insurance contributions or your income tax or whatever it might be, if you want to opt out of that welfare system, even though we would insist that you sort of prove some documentation that you've got yourself covered, or you've got enough money in your bank account at the moment that you won't need coverage. Yeah. That, to my mind, again, is a second best solution to get people out of that spiral. And at the lower end, I'm quite attracted to these sort of workfare arrangement ideas. Which
but I think, Mark, the whole point is that when it becomes an entitlement, the whole concept of saying, so both from a legalistic point of view and saying, in general, it's a contract. So it's an insurance way. It's a contract that you have with the government. Yeah. The only problem is that you don't have any say in what the government provides to you, because you are at the complete mercy of the state. So obviously you are going to vote for people that promise you more. So you have a kind of like a hazard, a moral hazard, in terms of saying, as for bureaucracy consider that they have the right to vote. And there are some libertarians that say, well, you should be able to vote for representative government only if you pay more into the system than what you take out, because otherwise you have a moral hazard, because you will have the incentive to vote for people that will give you more. And this is how empires go down. Roman Empire, Spanish Empire, it's always like that. More spending, more public spending, more public things. And then again, you don't have the gratitude that you had for societies, for the the way that welfare was done up until the 20th century, it was that you will have, so you work in a coal mine, and so you will have the labor society and stuff that I will have my fellow workers if they're having a problem. So if there is an accident in the coal mine and you have a widower, so the widow will get help by all the community. So it wasn't felt like an imposition, but it wasn't at the same time an entitlement, because when you get something for nothing, then again, you will think, oh, this is my right, God-given right, and there is no say about duty. Yep. So if you have a contract, so if I go and have accident insurance, I will have a major accident, I'm not able to work, and so I will just, for 6 months, I'm unable to work, so I don't get my paycheck again. So if I have a contract with Bupa or whatever, AXA or any other company, I can go to them and say, guys, I had a major accident, so I need to have some compensation. What was written in the contract? If they don't pay, I can bring them to tribunal, to court, and say, well, you're not paying. I paid my, every month I paid money, I'm not getting what I'm owed. But if you are at the mercy of the government can decide and say, yeah, no, I'm not paying you anymore, so you have to work. So
I'm really sympathetic to that. But my sort of answer is we are where we are, right? So, I think there's an awful lot we can learn from those friendly societies and cooperative societies. They were very much sort of what Edmund Burke would call the little platoons. There wasn't some overarching state system. These were very community-based. Therefore, there was social capital involved, not just money. You would know in your local area who you could trust, and who might be pulling the wool over your eyes, and all of the rest of it. So it had that on-the-ground community knowledge involving all of the people involved in the scheme. Wholly unlike the welfare state, which is sort of completely, inhuman. There'll be somebody who's sort of monitoring your disability payments, but there's no proximity as there was on the friendly societies. How about this for a madcap idea then? Let me just float this as a kind of completely crazy concept. Quite a lot of people take the option, I used to until they jacked up foreign aid spending, of sponsoring a child in a disadvantaged part of the world. The money does tend to go to the sort of child's wider community rather than just directly into the child's pockets. But in return for that, you get updates about how this child is progressing, how their education's going, how they're learning and developing, and all of the rest of it. Should we tag people who receive welfare and pair them with people who pay for the welfare? So I get an update or a letter from some chap who's sitting on the sofa and is presently unemployed, telling me each month what steps he's making to try and get.
That would be good. That would be great.
From an 8-year-old girl in Cameroon, I can't see why I can't get it from a 28-year-old man in Grimsby.
I think a better solution would be to copy the system that Yunus operated in Bangladesh and stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with the story, the kind of micro lending. Yunus Bank became a massive success in Bangladesh, India, and other countries, just because they were saying, I'm tapping a market that wasn't being served by banks, because banks will look at a widow with 3 children in a small village in the middle of nowhere and say, well, she has no collateral to give me, so of course I'm not giving her money. And then again, or maybe she's married to someone who's an alcoholic and will take the money away and go to drink it out, as it happens so often. But they said, well, no. If you presented me with a plan and saying we will buy some sewing machines, and then we will make a small company between us, a cooperative, where we can produce clothes and stuff and specific needs, and if you're giving me the money, okay. But then they will say, I'm not giving it to you directly, I'm giving you to the cooperative. So I have 20 other women in the village that are collectively responsible for the debt. And Yunus actually made a killing with it, massive profits, because they were saying they were so grateful for the lending that was given to them that they repaid in full. And if someone was behind, you will have all the other ladies that would look at it and say, wait, come on, you have got to come up with money, because otherwise we're not going to receive any more credit. again. So the kind of micro lending and collective responsibility, I know it's very tricky from a libertarian point of view, but in terms of saying, go ahead.
I mean, I absolutely think it's important. We have civil society cohesion, we have self-responsibility also on a community level, on a civic level, and these systems like the friendly societies had that, whereas the welfare system is atomizing, anonymizing, and isolating people. They don't need to have friends, they don't remain contact even with their siblings, because the sibling might actually give them a bit of tough love, give them a bit of pressure, you know, and they might lend them something or help them, but they're not going to help them forever. And this is a bit of tough love, and charity is somewhere in between what a family member would do. They actually they can craft and quickly respond and develop their policies. There's no entitlement, and I've seen a lot of charities who pick up particular groups and engage with them, learn about those groups, and then say things. Okay, we're going to help single women with children to move into a better place and help them construct their apartments and renovate their apartments. But there also is something in return, some kind of performance, and it's a kind of tough love concept. And I think that would pick up a lot of what is left over. But the biggest tragedy for me is not only the cost spiraling, but we can see the kind of people letting themselves, the self-indulgence, letting themselves go and going down a route which they're kind of hard to return and will self-regret. And that is really the problem with the welfare state. And in the moral hazard, Luca, you mentioned that's the big thing here. The moral hazard needs to be taken out. The moral hazard is also kind of for the individuals themselves. And that is where I feel is important. But at the other hand, for instance, going back to the reform proposal, if you wanted to push out, kind of suddenly withdraw all welfare from all foreigners, at the same time, and it's great, the example of Scott Walker's Wisconsin and what happened, that could happen too, but you might at the same time have to open up a bit employment and business and maybe take down or abolish the minimum wage laws to allow these people to be absorbed and then climb up themselves. I mean, what is a big tragedy of minimum wage laws from a libertarian perspective, often that they're a lot of the lowest rung of the ladder of employment. And once you, as a young person, or you've been truant, or you're coming from difficult situations, you never reach that first rung. You're never going to be, delivering, also with all the risks of if you don't work out to employers, you will never get that step up. And there's always easy options to delay and never get there. And that's the true tragedy. And that has to be put out there. And that's why I think I'm so hopeful. I know reform is not thinking like we are thinking. They want to do something about immigration, also pull out the incentives and want to kind of make it difficult for people to stay here. But I think this is a kind of Trojan horse in my view, which think will deliver a revelatory dynamic that you actually can survive. Of course you can survive in a country like Britain with so many opportunities without welfare. Of course you can.
I think the only ways that reform are doing that from a political point of view, because it's just definitely easier to sell, because you're selling a narrative. So your narrative is the system is perfectly fine as it is. No, don't worry. We're not going to go after your benefits. No, don't worry. But in order to make them sustainable, it's their fault, because the foreigners are stealing your benefit money and stuff. And obviously this makes no sense, because if you're looking at the projection, you see by the end of the decade, the bill for benefits and for disabilities and stuff will go from something like 50 or 60 billion pounds that is now to 400 billion pounds, which is completely insane. And you will keep, more money and will be borrowed. And so the whole, in terms of servicing the debt, will go from 100 billion pounds, which is pretty much the same that the UK spends in defense and education combined, just as for servicing the debt. If it keeps on going like that, you will, instead of just 20-30 billion pounds a year in additional debt, you will go up to 100 and stuff. So it will become completely unsustainable. But I think in terms of the big problem is that people are not financially educated enough to realize that stuff that sounds good, like, I don't know, I'll increase your minimum salary. Oh yeah, it's great, it's amazing, it's lovely. I will earn a couple of quid more. Yeah, sure. So if you are a 16-year-old and you want to go to a cheapy shop and get a job, the kind of summer job that used to be commonplace, now it's unsustainable because if I'm forced to pay you £16 or whatever it is, £14 an hour, I will get someone who is experienced. So you will not get the experience, and so you are completely cut out. So this is kind of the problem.
What I think as well. Look, I'm in architecture. We have been teaching at various universities. We're seeing students, and what I've seen with these, for instance, with respect to internship, we have to pay them fully, and and basically that means that particularly those who first generation moving to university, who are not as eloquent as those with academic parents, they want to move in, and they wouldn't have a chance. But if they could put the extra energy and effort in, and they would come to an internship, and we keep them, and it doesn't cost us an arm and a leg. Then they would actually have a chance to actually grow into the profession and learn and show their commitment and make up for the eloquence with real commitment and loyalty and hard work. But that has all been abolished. And if I even say and suggest, and we used to have these interns, and it also helped as a young company to grow. If I say this, I'm kind of canceled and denigrated, and I'm kind of exploiter, and you can't even articulate such an idea. And now, of course, that wave is a bit kind of easing off, but that's the problem. And back to the idea of, let's say, the indigenous, or white British working class and underclass milieu, they're actually, 1 or 2 generations longer in this cycle, and they're actually more atomized. They have less of a social fabric and family fabric left, and they're actually the lowest attainers when it comes to certain statistics of, educational attainment. They're at the bottom. White men or boys are at the bottom in terms of if you measure
the new underclass. The new underclass.
Reaching a kind of higher education degree, they're at the very bottom. And I think that is, of course, needs to be pointed out in parallel. But I just been very positive that what a great opportunity for all our foreign milieus to be kind of get the friendly push and get off their asses and flourish. That would be a great message.
I think that, I agree with much of what you guys have said. I should just flag up that often I think these discussions about welfare and poverty only look at the problem down one end of the telescope. And I'm not sure it's always the right end of the telescope to look down. One area that gets enormously overlooked when we discuss poverty and deprivation is, why is the cost of living so goddamn high? Why is it nearly impossible to get by in London, unless you're earning well in advance of the average wage? I mean, housing costs ludicrously high. Energy costs ludicrously high. I think over the last couple of generations, last 2 or 3 generations in London, we've moved to the average house price being 3 times the average wage, to the average house price now being 12 times the average wage. This is extraordinary. Add in energy as well. Once you've paid to get a roof over your head and you've heated your house, why is energy so goddamn expensive? Food even is more expensive than it should be. The question I sort of asked myself is, why can't you get by in England on £10,000 a year? I mean, I'm not saying you would live a life of luxury for that, but it seems to me that you should be able to get by on that. And the reason, of course, is that the government and government intervention massively increases the cost of living. Housing is the most obvious example because of planning restrictions. It seems to me sort of ludicrous. You're the architect, Patrik, but it seems to me on the face of it that, we should be able to build small houses extremely cheaply. Right. So, sure, if you want to live in a gorgeous 5-bedroom Georgian building in Mayfair, you're going to have to earn a lot of money and really save up. But if basically all you're trying to do is to put a roof over your head, why is it 200 grand to get into the property market? This is insane. And similarly, the energy to then heat your home is implausibly high because of government intervention in the energy sector. So I think that those of a free market bent need to talk an awful lot more about welfare, poverty and destitution from the other end of the telescope. That if costs fall radically for these staple products, for these life necessities like housing and heat and food, well, then the welfare spending that we're giving people to have to access those things falls as well. So if we can get the cost of living down, then the welfare bill should fall. But because the cost of living goes up and up and up because of more and more government intervention, the amount that you need in order to just get by, or perhaps even just have one or two tiny luxuries, is set ludicrously high. I actually want to live in a society where people can work part-time and get by just fine. You know, decide they want more leisure and they'll only have one short foreign holiday a year rather than 3. They'll live in a small prefabricated house somewhere in Zone 4 rather than in a lovely mansion in Belgravia. There's all trade-offs here, but it seems to me absurdly expensive. Everything is absurdly expensive. And if there was a government assault from the centre-right on the cost of living, that we're going to drill down on all of these prices, your money will stretch further, you would then need less of it.
Look, absolutely. And I give you the good news. We're working on a quite elaborate urban development policy program and policy paper, which is running into the 80 pages at this point, with all these points you're making. And the urban development and particular housing development process is no market at all. It's totally overregulated and generates these huge costs. And there are really some sacred cows which need to be kind of guided to the arbitrary, and we need to get back to development rights and property rights, and this kind of NIMBYism everywhere, where people trying to prevent development in each and every locale, and that generates these kind of spiraling prices.
This is an interesting point, and especially because you're an architect, maybe I can take the temperature on here. I obviously agree with you that we can sort of say, oh, NIMBYism, it's terrible. No blade of grass must die in vain, and therefore we can't actually build anything. Is all crazy. But again, looking at this from a kind of just a standard economics lens, is because we've got the incentives wrongly structured, right? So I'm incentivized to be a NIMBY. All of the incentives encourage me to not allow any more house building in Battersea, because that's the best way for me to keep the value of my property up. So I have a direct incentive. I mean, I'm not this sort of person and I haven't got the time, but the system incentivizes me to complain about any future local development, because all things equal, it will lead to my detriment. The scarcity of property falls, and therefore the value of my property falls. So don't you think we need to align the incentives correctly? And that's been, I suppose, the basis of many of the prescriptions or wild ideas that I've floated with you guys, that we need to look at who gains, how do we disperse the gains in land value if the land is repurposed for something else. So at the moment, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in the planning system, but if you own 300 acres of land that theoretically, physically, logically could be built on, but you have no permission for building on that land. The way it would work at the moment is that you use, as the landowner, every tactic in the book to try and secure that permission. So you're probably lobbying and perhaps in worst cases bribing local politicians and councillors or whoever else to give you that permission. And if you get it, the value of your previously fallow land goes up in value by, 10,000% or something. And you are suddenly a multi-millionaire because you had 300 acres of land upon which you have the permission to do nothing. And now you're suddenly going to become super rich just because the permission and the designation has changed. Shouldn't we find a way of making sure that that planning gain is then, if you like, given to or used to bribe the NIMBYs? I'm not saying the landlord should get nothing, but they shouldn't accrue the entirety of the planning gain. Maybe they get 5% of it, 10% of it, but the rest of it is, almost distributed in cash to the NIMBYs who would otherwise complain. And then the local community, I'm not sure exactly through what mechanism, whether it could be marketized or through a ballot box, gets to choose. So do you want, are you happy for that green land over there to be built on? There'll be another, 1,000 houses. Everything will be a bit noisier. We know you would prefer that to be a park that you can walk your dog in. However, there's a trade-off. If you allow us to build 1,000 houses, the value of that land will go up from X to 100x, and each of you will get a slice of the action. So if you vote to go with the planning permission, we will give you, I don't know, £3,000 a year for the next 10 years. Now, suddenly you've changed the incentives. I understand in France, for example, which is again quite a statist approach, but nevertheless it shows how incentives matter, that there is a rule, I won't get the details right, it's the concept that matters, that if a nuclear power station is built within 30 kilometers of your home, you get free energy for life. And if it's within 50 kilometers of your home, you get a 50% discount or something. And residents' associations in France are therefore going around with their placards saying, please build a nuclear power station near me. Right?
I think in Spain, let me get this one. In Spain, they had a massive problem like we had in Italy, and we still have it in Italy, to get the national depository for nuclear waste from the state, from the nuclear power plants that were they're still operational in Spain, and that in Italy we foolishly decided to get rid of. Spain has a national repository for that, and in terms of doing that, they just had to pretty much bribe, because of course geologists came up with 5 locations. Same thing was done in Italy. We have 5-6 locations where you can put this national depository for high-grade nuclear waste. And in Spain, they actually had it built because they said, well, of course, what do you want? Oh, you want a local museum. Okay, fine, we'll pay you for your local museum and then the stuff, and then you will have a reduction in terms of energy. I think down in the south of Italy, Basilicata was the same. They found some oil deposit, and they said, well, we need to drill. And the people there said, well, I don't want that because I want tourists to come here. And I said, yeah, but you will get a 35% discount for energy prices. And so this actually attracted companies that are energy intensive to build it there. And so this is kind of the thing. But the same thing happens. So my brother has a house in Mitcham in South London near Croydon. Yeah. And when he bought the house 6 years ago, and it was a nice terrace house, nothing. And then there was this big gas thingy, horrendous. And then they tore it down, and they're having a development being built in the next few years. And everybody was against it. And my brother was actually being a libertarian and stuff. He said, no, think about that. So they will build small supermarkets and stuff, shops and everything. There will be a small park, and then there will be maybe 100 apartments and stuff. So you will have more people. The high street, which is now dying, it will recover. Mm-hmm. And in terms of saying people don't get, Clapham Junction in the 70s was awful. It was a no-go area. And then it became, if you have an apartment there, it's worth now £1 million or more. So this kind of gentrification is just that there are incentives at the side. It's just that they are difficult to sell because it's a lot. People tend to think, oh yeah, more houses, my house is going to be worth less. Silly. That's not how it works. If the whole area gets gentrified, of course your house is going to be worth 3 times more.
No, you're right. I oversimplified the situation, suggesting that more housing, necessarily means lower prices. I mean, if that were true, housing in godforsaken areas of the country in the middle of nowhere would be very valuable, and cities would be very cheap to live in. So you're right. There's a more complex thing going on than that. I guess that what I'm saying there is that the solution, or at least getting part way to a solution, at least getting some sort of second or third best solution in a number of these policy areas, is to allow the price mechanism to operate, right? So, Luca, you called it a bribe, but it's not really a bribe, it's a payment. I mean, I guess when I go to the supermarket and load up a whole load of groceries in a trolley, I then bribe the supermarket to let me take those groceries home with me, right? It's just a payment, right? So let's just get payments and trade and the price mechanism operating. And maybe you're right. Maybe a developer could say, look, actually, I'm building all of these houses and it will actually add to the value of your house because look at all the amenities that are coming with it. We're building a new football stadium and a new cinema and, and restaurants, more and more restaurants will open. But we need to make trade possible, not just lobbying, because at the moment, all of this stuff is a lobbying exercise. And I want there to be less lobbying and more price mechanism involved in the system, basically.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, the at the moment, the whole process is just, in a way, rent seeking, where developers can no longer compete on product. Everything is prescribed. And then they just try to game the system. There's too much discretionary powers. And both on the level of the councillors and planners, as well as on the level of the, let's say, the constituencies, there's a kind of nearly irrational risk averseness, and you don't know much about it. All you know is if you prohibit, you have less problems down the line, less work for the planners, and maybe it's just easier if the first reaction is no. And that is a problem, and this needs to overcome. And there has been a mechanism, John Myers, London YIMBYs, came up with this idea of street votes, where he said, we have all in this central London, very close, for instance, to Liverpool Street, and right behind, you have these kind of carpets of 2-story terrace houses, and there's an enormous kind of value potential unlocked. And he said, street by street, allow the owners to vote to upzone, let's say, and double the GFA or triple the GFA, and then it will fall to them. Street by street votes, and it has actually been getting, and it's a wonderful kind of set of promotions and going around and talking and convincing people. It came into the Conservative Party and was picked up, and it went actually into the levelling up and infrastructure planning iteration bill, but it was too close to the changeover, and there was still a requirement of a number of, let's say, implementing regulatory operational kind of decisions to come through. So it sits there, and I don't know what Labour Party will do with it. They're so desperate with getting something going that they might actually activate that. I don't know. I hope even the Labour Party, they're getting desperate to get some houses off the ground, might use it. I don't know, or they just let it linger or abolish it in the end. But
we've touched obviously, and
this was this kind of letting incentives speak, letting price mechanisms overcome lobbying, and there are these ideas floating, and we are actually working on a number of those ideas, reinforcing them, and going through all the historical process of clogging up and freezing up and paralyzing the development process. In the last 2 years, it's been a kind of cataclysmic drop to zero, Neil, in terms of new houses. This has to do with the Grenfell fire and the exaggerated response, and pushing out a white paper without actually finishing the legislation. So nobody knows if you need a second staircase or not. Nutrient neutrality. Now every big development has to bring its own kind of water treatment, although that's not really the problem of nutrient kind of pollution. Is more agricultural than there's still the sacred cow of greenbelt. So we're working on that. It's a tough one, but there's also really one has to some extent, and that's a tough one. My view is one has to, to some extent disempower the community, which really, do they really care? And the councillors think they care, and they're some campaigning on prevention, but how many people are actually voting in the local elections once in 4 years? And what is 20%? Actually the legitimacy of these councillors? And I tell you, developers will push back. The legitimacy of, let's say a developer spends thousands and makes a fantastic scheme, renderings, developing plans, engineering, everything, and there would be a big new nugget and proposal. And that is a kind of 1,000-page, let's say, report and presentations. And then the local authority comes back, the planner comes back with 1 or 2 A4 sheets talking about milieu and some overshadowing. And if you would put that there, of course, the developers doesn't dare running with this because they hope to come back. But these things have no legitimacy. Exposing that would mean exposing something which is deeply, deeply troubling and illegitimate in a way.
No, I agree with all that. I mean, we talked on housing here. The other issue should apply to infrastructure as well. I mean, it seems to be absolutely impossible to extend an airport in Britain, right?
Forget that. Yeah, never
Oh,
again.
yeah, Heathrow.
No
Yeah,
airport,
the third runway.
The runway.
We've been engaged in, Heathrow and in other terminal, third runway.
What is that, 30 years?
It's going on forever.
30 years or 40 years? I can't remember.
Basically, forget it.
We've not extended runway capacity in the south of England since the end of the Second World War.
It's crazy.
I mean, it's completely mad. But again, I think the solution there, and I'm oversimplifying a bit, is, if you want to, massively extend, let's say, Heathrow, you kind of superimpose a dartboard on the local area and sort of say, right, well, actually, if you're in the bullseye right in the middle, we're going to have to demolish your home. So we'll offer you twice market rate for that. If you're in the outer bullseye, you're probably going to have to move away for 2 years and then move back. So we'll give you £50,000 or whatever it might be in order to account for that inconvenience. If you're towards the edge of the dartboard, well, there might be a bit more noise, possibly slightly more air pollution. We grant you that. So we'll offer you £5,000 for sake of argument. And a range of offers are made. And then the community can decide whether they want to take the wonga, do they want to take the cash, or not. And again, you've effectively got the price mechanism working. But with airport expansion, there's endless litigation. I mean, we've seen endless litigation over Wimbledon Tennis Club trying to extend its facilities. Because there's no way of making a trade between the Lawn Tennis Association and the local community, it just becomes a political fight about lobbying or a legal fight in a court. Get the price mechanism in. That's why infrastructure is not being built. And I'm sure you're right, Patrik, in what you implied, that we're taking beauty out of architecture as well because we've commoditized it. That everything is so over-regulated that there's a standard commoditized designed by the state way that everybody has to live. So the imagination and creativity and aesthetics of an architect are almost entirely knocked out of the arena, right? I
mean, but also what is for me so important, if you really have a thriving city, and we're living in a totally different era, what I call the post-forest network society, very different from the 50s, 60s, which was medical mass production, suburbanization. We now need to come back. We have an urban renaissance, and you need to really weave a kind of co-location synergy network, and you need to have freedom of reallocating plots. And if you find the plots, there should be total freedom of programming this to its most best value proposition, and that is all taken care of by planners now who prescribe everything, not only the total quantum, the use mix, and when it comes to residential, the actual unit mix, how many 4-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, they're prescribing every single size of room and every facility in every room. And then there are wonderful ideas like co-living. Suddenly you have, it's very, very small units and free co-working and shared TV and also more social spaces. And these things are just blocked and not allowed for. They need a loophole to show themselves, but then they're kind of stopped in their tracks. That's the tragedy. And you're absolutely right. The cost of living and the prosperity loss is invisible because it's this guy on the other side of an opportunity calculation, which nobody knows about. And that's the tragedy. So this is a huge topic for me, and I'm onto that. And this is massive, 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 because it's also something which we all should cherish. It's not only getting five more steaks and better nutrition. The place of living, where you live and where you're located, and that it's kind of fresh and updated, is just part of quality of life. And that is all kind of a little bit kind of stopped in its tracks. And that's it, as well as mobility. I believe, for instance, leveling up. Really? Mm-hmm. No, London can grow. I mean, Tokyo is 35 million, right? And London is 8 million. So there's a lot of scope to have that kind of Randstad-like condition between Cambridge, Oxford, Birmingham, London, Brighton, and make a kind of metropolis where everybody would actually should go. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can bring half of the UK into that condition. I mean, like in Serbia, for instance, was just there, where more than half of the country lives in Belgrade. Mm-hmm. And growing, and they have the dynamism and energy and so on. So all of that is kind of out of the picture, and you kind of the economic costs of that, and every single investment in a way has some kind of real estate and property and upgrading element. and all of that is kind of paralyzed and clogged up. It's a tragedy.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think that obviously we've gone completely on a tangent. So we had a title that was saying, well, how is Labour going to bankrupt Britain for good and stuff? We've talked about it, but we're talking from another perspective, which has been, but that's the beauty of having a conversation. You never know exactly where it's going to lead. So it's been absolutely great. I'm just looking at the clock over here. I said, we said, yeah, it's going to be 1 hour and stuff. Yeah, it's almost 2 hours. So we're going to wind it down. But just because with a final thing, that I just blatantly stole from the Konstantin Kissing and of trigonometry and stuff. So the last question is, what is the one thing that actually it's important that we talk about that is not talked about at all? Considering we have talked about the state of the country, how we can recover the spirit of the country and stuff from all sorts of things. So from the house, being proud of your neighborhood and the economy, and then making sure that you're not entitled to stuff, but you earn your living, something that was quintessentially British. The fact of saying, I'm not accepting charity from anyone. I can do it on my own, my community pride and everything. This is completely lost. It's not an accident. It's been done on purpose for the past years. So thinking of that, what could be the one thing that you would talk about that it's not being talked about at the moment? I'll let Mark lead on that.
Okay, well, it is being talked about, but in a rather technical sense at the moment, and it's an area I've committed myself to studying, is what is the impact of AI really going to be? And I haven't reached a firm conclusion here. I'm not quite sure whether it will be a kind of welcome boost to productivity, a bit like the internet, for example, or mobile phones, or the invention of the personal computer, all useful incremental steps forward in productivity. Or is it something much more revolutionary than that? Is AI so powerful that it is going to completely transform our society and our economy? And if it is that big, not just a kind of another dot-com boom, if it is that big, what are the implications for policy? Are we going to find a world in which 90% of present jobs are simply done by AI in 5 years' time? Could it come on that quickly? What are the implications for that? I'm hugely positive and optimistic about AI, but my question is it actually going to be the massive game changer that some people claim? And if it is, the implications for economics and politics are absolutely enormous. And therefore, I think not just people of a libertarian bent, but of any particular political philosophy need to work out what the new way of thinking about politics might be if AI is all that it's cracked up to be in some quarters. This could be, I'm an agnostic at the moment, but this could be the game changer that of the likes we've never seen, bigger than the Industrial Revolution. And if those claims are even half true, the implications are enormous. So don't we need to start talking about the world as it might look in the 2030s, rather than the world that we have witnessed and experienced, say, since the millennium? That's where I'd like to shift the debate onto. But I'm presently a layman in this regard, no sort of expert at all. So my promise to myself is to get myself across what's actually happening here, because it could be, I'm not saying it will be, but it could be totally transformative to human society.
Yeah, we've had the first episode of this new format and podcast was actually devoted to the discussion on AI, future for freedom and revolution. Patrik actually was a proponent of AI positivism, and instead we've had actually the other gentleman that was intervening that was much more skeptical and stuff. So in terms of saying, Patrik, what is the one thing that we are not talking about that we should be talking more? Aside from AI, because otherwise, if people are curious about that, you can go YouTube channel, first episode. It's a 1 hour and a half discussion on the whole conversation. So
I don't know if Mark was ever on the left. That's where I started. as a Marxist, historical materialism, and the awareness of technology as a driver, as a truly kind of challenging and active and potentially propelling force, which then has a lot of consequences of societal reorganization, etc. So I'm thrilled about this. Actually, I'm an accelerationist, if you like. And my point, though, I wanted to make at the end is we need, the title of the podcast is Give Freedom a Chance. And I've been saying daring more degrees of freedom. I'm happy to do that, even if it gives us a little bit more anxiety, a bit more kind of uncertainty. But on the reward side, I'm a risk taker sensitivity, and I just don't want this kind of paralyzing, slowing down, and these potentials, these technological potentials, that they're kind of happening elsewhere and not in Europe is a tragedy for me. So I would want to let's dare more degrees of freedom and run with the uncertainty and gain the rewards. Because what I also often really think this entrepreneurial freedom and also this idea of becoming more self-directed and self-responsible is in the end also an end in itself. It's part of our flourishing. We are adventurous people. We don't want to be safe and lulled into safeties. We're always curious and projecting forward. It's part of our deep anthropology, I would believe. That's why we reach where we're reaching, and this degrees of freedom are not only a means to an end, but they're also kind of something which is an end in itself, certainly for me and many others. And I want to excite people about that. Go out there and we need to therefore also open up degrees of freedom and entrepreneurship. It will deliver prosperity and it will be cumulative, and therefore will really see the difference in 20, 30 years. But it also is a thrill to live like this. And I'm telling you, for me, part of that is I'm doing well enough. What really bothers me about this kind of statism, this closing down, that I feel all the fun of life is kind of taken out. And the fun of life is this entrepreneurship and exploratory life and this free life.
Yeah, I think the main point is that we need to go back. So when there are people that say, well, kind of nativist stuff, they say, oh, we should go back to British values. And actually, no one really knows exactly what British values are. Well, if I look back at history, I think that if you don't want to go like Napoleon said that England was a nation of shopkeepers and stuff, because he despised merchants and stuff, or was it Louis XIV? I can't remember. So the whole point is saying statism and stuff. They say, I will take away your freedom and I will give you a predictable life and stuff. I always found it exceedingly boring. That's why I've lived in 5 countries and I moved along and stuff. And every time there was an opportunity, I always said, oh, I'll go for it. Yeah, sure. Yeah. What else can go wrong? I think people might need to look at the future with a little bit less, glass half empty thing and saying, yeah, well, you can manage. You can do that. You can, things may go bad. You can be laid off. Happened to me. It was really painful and stuff with the whole pandemic thing. And you can get into the wrong situation from a job point of view, and then you can get back on your feet. And this is actually what people don't want, because free people are really hard to contain, and they're really hard to just say. If you are confident about the value that you add to the world, actually it's a lot difficult to put you down. So I would love to thank you, Mark Littlewood, for being with us a lot longer than we said that we're going to. So lovely. So can you tell me where can people find you across the UK if you have any meeting that is scheduled in the next couple of weeks or stuff? Where can we find you?
Yeah, go to popularconservatism.com. You can find our website there. Then really the most important, or you can follow us at PopCon UK on X or Twitter as it used to be known. But the best way to keep up to date with our activities is go to our website and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. So every week we send out a bulletin. It's just gone out today on Friday. Every Friday afternoon we send out a bulletin with a little bit of commentary from me, a few catch-ups of what we've said in the media over the preceding few days, and a list of all of our events up and down the land. So we never ask you for money and we don't spam your inbox, but you'll get a weekly bulletin from us, and get that by going to popularconservatism.com. That's our website. You can sign up for free there.
Okay, lovely. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Patrik, for being here again, even if it's a Friday afternoon. Thank God it's Friday, so ready for the weekend again. Thank you a lot for being here, Patrik.
Thank you so much. It was cracking. Thanks so much, Mark.
Really
Oh,
enjoyed
lovely, lovely. Obviously, the biggest thanks that we have to give is for all our audience that's been here. So again, if you haven't, please join the YouTube channel of the Libertarian Party UK. For the time being, this podcast will be, yes, one episode a week. We're shifting a lot. It's just we have some technical problems. So probably a little bit down the road, we will try to come up with a precise time, but we just want to have live conversations live so that you can join in. So if you know someone that could be interested, share the link. Follow the Libertarian Party UK on X, on YouTube, on Facebook and stuff. Again, thank you all for being here, and I hope you found this conversation interesting, and I'll wish you a very pleasant weekend, and we'll see you next week. Potentially, it should be, it's not confirmed at the moment, it should be Wednesday at 6 p.m. UK time. Obviously, we'll just send notification on social media. Thanks again for being here. I've been Luca Bocci. This was Give Freedom a Chance, and I'll see you next week. Thank you and good.